So the question is, how are you helping your family during this crisis time? Well, one of the ways I do it is by making bread. And here's how I do it. First, you're going to need some sort of scale. I have a digital scale, a mixing bowl, some yeast, some regular table sugar, some oil, and some flour. Set the scale to 0 with the bowl on it. I use grams because grams are more reliable than cups, especially for bread. Add 1 tablespoon of sugar. Add 1 tablespoon of yeast, or 1 yeast packet. Add 1 tablespoon of salt. I use sea salt, the pink kind. And then I add oil until I get to 75 grams. Then I add flour. Bread flour is the best, but I'm using here all-purpose flour, unbleached. And you add that until you get about 6 to 80 grams total so far. Then add warm water from the faucet. Your warm water, basically I turn the hot water on as hot as it can get, and I put the warm water in there. And I put that in there till about 1055, 1065, somewhere in that range. And that's the total. So just a little bit more. A little bit more. That's good. Then you take your mix to the mixer. Use the hook. If you're making bread, use a hook. You don't have to do this with a mixer, though. You can do this by hand, and it doesn't take much time. You just basically run it until it picks up all of the flour. After a little while, the bowl will form, and you've got a little ball here. You want it to be somewhat dry, but you don't want it to be too dry, because if it looks like sand, it's too dry. If it's sticking to the bowl, it's too wet. You have to add a little bit of flour to make it a little bit less. So here I am adding a little bit of flour just to dry it up just a little bit. And see, I'm folding it. You want to fold it to develop the gluten. I'm adding a little bit more flour. Folding it again. So I have the ball. I'm just going to transfer it into a bowl. Again, folding it again. The more you fold it, the more it develops the gluten, and that's what you're going to need to do in order for it to stay round. And then cover it and let it sit and rest. Oh, I have to make sure it's folded better. There we go. It's still hanging off. You have to make sure it's sealed. If a lot of air gets into the bowl, what happens is you get a hard crust over it, and then it looks kind of weird. Okay, after it's rested for a little while, you can see it's flattened out a little bit. It's opened up. It's fermented just a little bit. Scrape it from the bowl gently. You don't want it to pop all the bubbles that are forming. You want the bubbles to stay there. That's the alcohol and the carbon dioxide forming from the yeast. That's what's going to give it the flavors that you want. So you break it from the bowl. It's going to be loose and light now. It's going to have lots of bubbles in it. And you're going to fold it again a bunch of times until it doesn't fold anymore. I'm shaking it to make it nice and full. I fold it nice and neatly. And now I'm tightening the outside skin. Again, this is all to develop the gluten so that when you bake it, it actually will push outward and it will keep a shape. If you don't develop the gluten, it won't do that. And then cover it once again, and now this time let it ferment for about 2 to 6 hours or more. Okay, so when you're getting ready to take the fermented bread dough, I just use a very basic cutting board. Try to keep the mess in check. I sprinkle on it some corn flour. You can use semolina flour, anything that you can put in the oven and not burn really. You want to keep the bread from sticking to the pan that you're going to bake it in. There's the fermented bread or bread dough. Now notice it's more than doubled in volume. This is over 6 hours of fermentation. You scrape it from the bowl once again to, try to keep it from popping all the bubbles. You want to keep as much of that as you can. That's the good stuff. It's very loose and needs to be folded again, but don't squish it too much because you don't want you don't want to flatten it out. There it is, loose. Fold it as much as you can. You can also use this dough mix for pizza as well. It works the same. Although, people that specialize in making pizza might say, I don't know. But this is my favorite recipe for bread because it tastes good and it works well, and this is what I've developed over the years. So there you go. You got a nice tight ball, and you put it on the cutting board. It's going to be a little sticky, and that's okay. And then I take, you need it to be able to expand, and you want it to expand in a special way. So I use a bread knife. It's not for cutting the bread, but for slicing. There it is. My friend Bill gave that to me. You can use a real sharp knife, doesn't matter. But basically this is a razor. It's very sharp, and you're cutting for the bread to expand in certain places. And you're actually cutting the gluten strands. All right, so, and then I'm going to be a little fancy here and cut on both sides. So when it expands, it's gonna push those outward and make those nice and tight. But you'll see the lines on the outside of the bread when you're done. And now I'm going to turn on the oven, and I'm going to set the oven for 500 degrees with enough space for my Dutch oven, crock pot basically, inside the oven to go in there. And I'm putting a little bit of basil and tomato on there because I use the bread for stuff like that. And then cover it again while you are letting your oven preheat. Now I've preheated the oven to 500 degrees, and I've got my cast iron Dutch oven in there. And inside the cast iron Dutch oven is also a layer of cornmeal on the bottom so that you don't stick the bread to it. That's what the steam is from. And you put that cast iron pot inside the oven and let that preheat with the oven. So now it's ready to go, it's hot. I'm going to put the top back on and I'll put it back in the oven. Be careful, use gloves. Make sure you have plenty of space for the oven. All set. I'm going to put that in for about a half hour. Okay, now after about a half hour or so, I take it out. And I'm going to transfer it to basically a baking mat. Now it's a little tight, so I can't get in there to get it out, so I'm going to have to do some finesse here. And there it is so far. It's all nice and shaped. Now I just got to do the outside crust. And then I also have another bread, but before I put that in there, I got to put some. I just by dumping it that way, I moved all of the cornmeal on the bottom of the pan over to the corner, and I can't move it back, so it's too hot. So I'm going to put some fresh stuff in there. And I'm going to put my second loaf in. Try to do this as quickly as you can because every minute that the oven's open, it's losing temperature. And you don't have to have it necessarily at 500. It could be 400. Whatever your oven is comfortable with, whatever the people in your house are comfortable with, because putting it at 500 is going to make your house really hot. And then put it in for at least another half hour. Okay, so now the first loaf is definitely done. Taking it out. And notice I have a place for it to completely cool. You want air to circulate underneath it if possible, somehow. And there you have it. Now I just have to let it cool. You don't want to cut it until it's completely cool. So I usually wait until next morning. And there's my second loaf. So the next morning, ready to go. The bread is nice and cool. I put away the cooling rack and put it back on a cutting board, and now I can cut the bread for breakfast. There you have it. And that's how you make bread, at least the way I make it. Lots of ways to make bread, but I make it about at least once every couple days.